So good evening, everybody, and on behalf of Tecnológico Monterrey, I want to thank Enrique and the entire US-Mexico Foundation team for the invitation, for allowing us to be part of the North Capital Forum, and for playing a role to bring North America closer, and particularly to contribute to one of the last goals that was mentioned earlier, to increase the student mobility. We can play an important role in that sense. It's not easy, just a small deviation in our case. If you estimate today there are probably 35,000 Mexicans, only 35,000 Mexicans abroad, probably 25% are Tec de Monterrey students on an exchange program. And that needs to change, it needs to be broader. And most of our students go to Europe, not to North America, but that's for a different panel. Chris, welcome. Thank you for being here. Congratulations on an amazing book. Thank you for your ideas and shaping a global debate around the semiconductor industry. You mentioned in your book that we rarely talk about chips, yet they have created the modern world. Can you talk us a little bit about how semiconductors serve as the foundation for various industries, and why are they considered as the central pillar of the global economy?
Well, most people never think about semiconductors because they're buried deep inside of your electronic devices. When I told my mother that I was going to write a book about semiconductors, she said it sounded like a very boring book and that I shouldn't write it. But in fact, all of us rely on not just dozens, but hundreds and thousands of semiconductors just over the course of our daily lives. They're in our smartphones and our PCs, of course, but they're also in almost every other type of manufactured goods, from cars, which have 1,000 semiconductors inside of them if they're a new car, to medical devices, to aviation. And so the entire world economy, almost all the key sectors of world GDP are built on a foundation of silicon chips. And as we learned during the pandemic, we really can't live without them. And just to give one data point, the global car industry is estimated to have lost almost $500 billion in revenue during the pandemic due to chip shortages, even though the chips in question often only cost $1 or $2. They couldn't be sourced.
Did your mother change her opinion after reading the book? Or?
I think I convinced her.
Good. We were talking earlier that even the automobile industry didn't know the amount of chips and the type of chips that were into their products, and that was part of the problem, right?
That's right. In a typical car, the chips were in a subcomponent of a subcomponent. And so car companies have spent the last couple of years figuring out actually how many chips they do rely on and who produces these chips and what alternative suppliers are there. Often the answer is there are no alternative suppliers, which is why car companies have been leading the trend of manufacturing firms trying to chart supply chains, to understand vulnerabilities, and they hope to change the shape of supply chains to make them more resilient.
Throughout your book, you mentioned that there are risks associated with the current dependence on a limited number of semiconductor suppliers and players along the different parts of the value chain. What are the risks that we are facing in the future given this concentration?
The primary risk is, I think, obvious, which is Taiwan-China risk. Today, 90% of the most advanced processors can only be made by one company on one small island, which China also happens to regard as a renegade province. There's no other company that can produce most of the processors in your smartphones, the processors in many people's PCs that are core to the AI revolution. All of the chips training AI systems today are currently manufactured in Taiwan. And this is an extraordinary, a staggering vulnerability, given that we know the military balance year after year is swinging in China's favor. And we also know that the Chinese government has explicitly said that they don't rule out use of force against Taiwan to seize control of the island. So the entire world economy is hanging on this hope that peace will prevail in the Taiwan Straits. And I hope that it does. But if it doesn't, we're hopelessly unprepared for what would be a catastrophic hit to global manufacturing. The pandemic was, I think, just a minor version of the shortages that we face in all types of manufacturing if something went wrong. And that's why in Europe, in Japan, in the US, in India, in Korea, everyone is asking the question, how can we restructure supply chains to become less reliant on China and less reliant on countries that China regularly threatens to invade? And that's the challenge that most of the world is trying to work through right now.
What do you think are some of the strengths and weaknesses from a North American perspective in terms of the semiconductor sector?
I think that the strengths is actually where we should start, because there are an extraordinary number of strengths. North America is the largest continent by revenue share in the chip industry, largely thanks to US chip design firms, companies like NVIDIA, the most valuable company in the chip industry, or Qualcomm or Broadcom. There's also a lot of advanced chemicals production and machine tool production used in the chip industry that happens in North America. And then many of the key companies that buy chips, Apple, for example, Ford, GM, Dell, HP, are also companies that are headquartered in North America and that have operations in North America. And so there's huge demand coming from North America for highly advanced semiconductors. If you ask which continent is installing the most AI chips, North America, by far, by far. And so there's huge strengths. The weaknesses that we face are twofold. One is our reliance on East Asia, and in particular on Taiwan, for manufacturing the most advanced chips. But two, the problem that we really ought to try to solve is that much of the packaging and assembly of semiconductors, which is a easier step, less technologically complex, today happens in East Asia, in China, in Taiwan, in Vietnam, in Malaysia. It's extraordinarily concentrated in East Asia. And so manufacturers in North America almost exclusively rely on packaging and assembly in East Asia for the chips that they need.
What's your take on the CHIPS Act? Is it the right type of industrial policy or public policy to strengthen the strength and to address the risks?
You know, I think the CHIPS Act it's a very important piece of legislation, but it focuses on just one part of the supply chain, which is the manufacturing of chips themselves. And that's very important. It's already led to a huge increase in investment in chip making facilities in the US, both by US firms, but also by non-US firms, Samsung, TSMC, building new facilities, for example, in Texas and in Arizona. But if you only have that part of the supply chain, you don't have finished chips. And where we don't yet have a strategy is when it comes to the packaging and assembly of semiconductors, which is the part that's today totally concentrated in East Asia. And CHIPS Act money is not focused on this. And right now, almost all manufacturing firms have no strategy other than relying on East Asia and hoping that somebody else will devise a strategy to move some of this activity to North America. I think this is the challenge, but also the opportunity, because there's no reason why a big chunk of assembly and packaging couldn't happen in North America.
We were discussing earlier that given the geopolitical challenges between the US and China, the supply chain will change somehow, and that there are at least 20, 25 countries going after chunks of this supply chain. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics and how different countries are going about it?
Yeah, I think you're right. The supply chain is already changing. You see it in terms of where servers are assembled. You see it in terms of where computers are assembled. You're beginning to see it in terms of where phones are assembled. Everyone who manufactures in China is looking to diversify their manufacturing base. And they're looking all around the world for alternatives to Vietnam, to Thailand, to Taiwan, to India, to Mexico, to Central and Eastern Europe. And so there's an extraordinary race or a competition underway between all of these countries and regions to win a share of the manufacturing that's moving out of China. And that's exciting. It's exciting to see supply chains shift so rapidly, but it also means that it's hard because there are so many competitors in this race, a lot of whom are putting substantial amounts of money, government money, behind this effort. It means if you want to compete, you've got to have an alliance between government and industry that provides a compelling story about why you should invest in your country rather than in any of the other 15 or 20 countries that are trying to attract the exact same investment.
We have focused more in the US. Focusing a little bit on Mexico, you recently wrote a foreign affairs article on Mexico microchip advantage. What are some of potential opportunities that Mexico have, and what do we need to do to capture those opportunities?
Yeah, I think there are two that I would highlight. One is on the assembly and packaging side. There is a ton of manufacturing that happens in Mexico that is hugely reliant on semiconductors packaged and tested in East Asia. Autos, medical devices, aviation, all of these semiconductors are packaged in East Asia. So even if they're manufactured by TSMC in Arizona or by Samsung in Texas, currently they will be sent to Taiwan or to Thailand or to Malaysia for packaging before returning to manufacturing supply chains in Mexico. And this is inefficient. but it's also dangerous because it adds an entire additional continent to your manufacturing process. And it just so happens that almost all of the packaging in East Asia happens either in China, Taiwan, or in countries right next to China and Taiwan. So it's a huge resilience risk, and Mexico ought to be winning some of this business. I think there's a real opportunity for Mexico to win semiconductor test, assembly, and package business if there's a strategy to pursue it. I think the second aspect of opportunity is in semiconductor design. Most of the money in the chip industry is made by companies that design semiconductors. Manufacturing is super important, and we've got to be investing more in it, but design has for several decades been the most profitable part of the chip industry. It's the highest value add part of the chip industry. And it's a place where North America is by far the world's leader. And I think if you look at the leading companies in the industry, from NVIDIA to Qualcomm to Broadcom, they all are facing a talent crisis. They're all searching the world for the employees that they need. And I see no reason why Mexico couldn't play a role in design as well. And that's especially important because as it gets harder and harder to pursue Moore's law, harder and harder to shrink the transistors on your chips, we're going to be relying more on smarter designs for semiconductors to provide performance enhancements, which means we're going to need more people designing chips in 10 years' time than we have today. That's a huge opportunity for a skilled workforce.
From the Canadian perspective, what could be opportunities and risks for them?
Well, the Canadian government's already put out a very detailed strategy to try to attract some advanced packaging, R&D intensive packaging to Canada. There's also a very well-developed ecosystem of semiconductor design startups, especially around the Toronto area. And so I wouldn't say Canada's a big player in the chip industry, but it's an important player in a number of key niches. And especially when you look at chips designed for AI applications, a couple of the leading firms are actually Canadian firms.
We were mentioning earlier that, particularly in the case of Mexico, you need an ecosystem, and to jumpstart an ecosystem, it takes a coordination effort. What the Mexican government officials here from states or federal, what recommendations will you give to them? What mechanisms have worked?
No, I think here's the problem is that when I talk to companies that are assembling PCs in Mexico, they say, we would like to assemble more PCs in Mexico, but we don't have the electronics components ecosystem we need to do so cost effectively. When I talk to components firms, they say, well, we'd like to build more components in Mexico, but we don't have the PC assembly base to really justify building a new factory. So you do have a coordination problem. And I think the biggest challenge is to get the producers of chip assembly and the users in a room and help them realize that actually both of them want to be investing in Mexico. And I think that's empirically true. I think they haven't realized that there is an ecosystem waiting to be created. And if there's a way to solve that coordination problem, I think there's a real opportunity. Government is a natural player to help play a coordinating role here. Government can play certainly by offering financial incentives, and many governments are offering very generous financial incentives around the world. But even if you don't have the financial incentives, you've got to be playing on the coordination side. And I do have the sense that that's missing right now.
Can you talk a little bit about how car companies and technology companies are integrating backwards to designing their own chips and the implications of that?
Well, today, every manufacturing company is trying to understand how the chips in their systems impact the software they're running and how their chips may or may not give them a competitive advantage. And what you see is more and more companies are thinking harder about chip design for their own system. So it's already the case that all of the world's big data center operators design their own semiconductors that are perfectly optimized to the workloads they're running in their data centers. But car companies are probably next. Tesla already designs its own chips, and I think it's not going to be a unique in that regard for very long. In aviation, in agricultural equipment, there's a lot of use cases that have unique data demands, unique compute demands, and therefore companies are realizing that if they understand the chip designs better and can influence the chip designs, they can compute more efficiently and therefore take more advantage of their data. And as every company tries to understand how they can apply AI to make their systems better, they're going to need more efficient computing, which means semiconductors that are honed to their use case. And so for auto manufacturers or aviation or medical devices, more and more companies will be designing chips in the future than are today, which means that they have even more at stake in understanding who's producing their semiconductors, who's packaging their semiconductors, where is it happening, and do you have a supply chain that's sufficiently integrated that they can track that process and tweak that process so it best suits their own needs.
You have mentioned also in different podcasts and interviews that, and some of the US policy comes not from an economic perspective, but from a security perspective. What are some of the challenges around national security and regional security for the semiconductor industry?
I think there are two challenges. One is just the disruption risk. If China blockades or attacks Taiwan, we're facing the greatest disruption to world manufacturing since 1929, since the Great Depression, and that's not an overstatement. Multiple $1 trillion of disruption in just the first quarter. And so that's security challenge number one. And there's good quantitative studies that have modeled it, and that's the number they found. So a meaningful hit to global GDP in Q1 after a Chinese disruption of Taiwan's ability to export chips. So there's a ton at stake just in that question, but it actually goes beyond that, because as we use more chips in all manner of devices, and as chips are gathering more information, processing more information, the question of, well, who has access to this information becomes much more important. And so if you think of the number of sensors on your car, if you have a new car, it will have LiDAR sensors, radars, infrared sensors, optical sensors. It will know your location at all times, know what music you're listening to, know who you're calling. Suddenly the question of data security in your car becomes pretty important. And therefore the question of who's producing the chips in your car also becomes pretty important. And that's why North American car companies are increasingly asking for chips made in North America. It's a resilience question in case of a shock, but it's also a security question.
You were mentioning that we need to go beyond software security or cybersecurity to hardware security, and that's also a challenge in itself, right?
It's a huge challenge. We don't really have the tools that we have in the software side to actually even assess hardware vulnerabilities. They're just not very well developed. And so everyone trusts that the chips that are designed work the way they do, and more importantly, that everyone trusts that the circuit boards that have dozens of chips on them that they get shipped in from distributors in East Asia don't have one additional device on it that could turn it on or off at will. And we haven't found too many instances in the open source literature of that happening, but I think we're probably a bit too sanguine about the fact that that is happening. And if you talk to people in intelligence agencies, that's something they worry a whole lot about.
A couple of years back, everybody was saying that every company is now a software company. Is it the same now in terms of semiconductor and electronic hardware? Do you think we're at that stage?
Well, I think the boundary between software and hardware is breaking down. Because today you can't run the most advanced workloads without having a very intricate understanding of the chips in your data center, or the chips in the cloud computing firm whose data centers you're renting. If you look at NVIDIA, the world's biggest chip firm, $1 trillion company, the first $1 trillion chip company, what differentiates them from their competitors? Well, actually, it's their software libraries. Mm-hmm. They've got software that is specifically designed to work with their chips, and that's their competitive advantage. Think of the world's biggest software firms, Google, Facebook. They all design their own chips. Inside of Google's data centers are chips that Google designed to optimize the speed on which Google undertakes AI workloads. And so there's actually no difference today between a software firm and a hardware firm. If you're running AI, you need to understand both.
Moving to talent and capabilities, what are some of the shortages in talent that you foresee for the semiconductor industry in general, but particularly for North America?
There's a lot of really niche skills that are needed in semiconductor manufacturing. And that's true both at the very advanced scientific level, PhDs in material science or chemistry, but it's also true for the construction jobs that are needed to build semiconductor manufacturing facilities. So for example, you need certain types of welding that are not normally done outside of chip manufacturing plants. And there's a huge shortage of this type of welder in Arizona right now because of all the construction underway. So workforce shortages really run the gamut of skill level. But I think the focus in public discussion has been too much on worker shortages in chip manufacturing, because that's the short run challenge. But the big issue is, do we have the workforce that's going to be capable of capitalizing on all of these new changes in terms of chip design and in terms of making use of the AI capabilities that that new chips enable. And so that's really where we ought to be focusing, not just over a 1 or 2 year time horizon, but a 10 or 20 year time horizon. And there's going to be immense demand for a workforce that understands how to design chips and how to optimize your software with your semiconductors.
In terms of R&D, in Mexico, we spend less than 0.5% of GDP in R&D. Probably the US around 3%. I don't have the number for Canada, but what's the role of R&D not only in the current development of semiconductors, but the future?
Well, it's certainly critically important, and we've seen government play a huge role in investing in R&D on the frontier of semiconductors. It was US government contracts that actually paid for the initial R&D that led to the invention of the first chips, which were used in US missile systems in the 1950s and 1960s. So R&D is critically important. But I also think that the key challenges the industry faces is actually not R&D. The chip industry spends as much on R&D as any industry except for pharma. There's a lot of R&D money out there. The challenge is, I think, translating new scientific knowledge coming out of universities into commercial products. No. And that translation is something that has not been a focus in recent years. Universities are great at doing research. Companies are great at mass manufacturing products, but having the close relationship.
Bridging
exactly
the discovery with products to the market.
That's the challenge. In the chip ecosystem, the phrase is lab to fab. How do you take something from a lab and move it to a fab, which is what you call a chip making facility?
You mentioned, going back to the geopolitics, you mentioned that China is 100% committed to being self-sufficient in terms of the sourcing of chips, and that has a lot of implications for the US, for companies, for Japan, Taiwan. Can you talk a little bit about that Chinese strategy?
So China certainly wants to be self-sufficient in semiconductors, although today they're far from it. China spends as much money each year importing chips as it spends importing oil. So it's an extraordinary reliance today that China has on the rest of the world. They import chips from Taiwan, from Japan, from Korea, from the United States. But they've been spending tens of billions of dollars a year, so roughly 1 CHIPS Act a year since 2014, all the way up to the present, trying to domesticate this industry. And they've made real strides. And I think the latest Huawei phone launch, which some of you may have seen, is the latest data point in China's ability to produce not the most cutting-edge chips, but chips that are pretty close. And we're going to see Western firms, as a result, lose market share in China because they'll be replaced by Chinese competitors, which are just as good or good enough and heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. And so this is driving a bifurcation in electronic supply chains, because foreign companies are realizing their market share in China is declining inexorably as their technological edge is eroded and as the Chinese government provides huge financial incentives to domestic competitors. And as they lose their market share in China, their commitment to manufacturing in China also declines commensurately. And so what you are already beginning to see is electronics firms in the US, in Taiwan, in Korea, in Japan, actively trying to rebalance, making very expensive decisions about where they build their next factory, building it outside of China, building it in Vietnam or in Thailand or in India instead, because they realize that their market share is declining in China. As their market share declines, so does their leverage. And they're worried they're going to be facing increasing pressure from the Chinese government as a result.
I think that's a very important point, because you were saying this is going to be a close time, a close window, or a wave you mentioned, that in which all these Korean, Japanese, Taiwanese companies want to divest from China, and they're deciding where to move that capacity. Could North America, Mexico, the US attract part of that capacity? And if so, what do we need to do that?
I think there are some things we're not going to attract. We're not going to attract any smartphone assembly to North America. That's all going to stay in Asia, but that's okay. We're already attracting PC assembly, server assembly, semiconductor manufacturing. A big chunk of the electronic supply chain is looking seriously at North America. But as you say, there's a really small window because companies can't wait. They can't wait for the next election cycle. They can't wait for working groups to be set up. They can't wait for coordination problems to be solved. They need to invest now because customers will need their products in short order. And so that's the challenge, is if you want more investment, you've got to be winning the race against Vietnam and Thailand and Singapore and India and Poland and the rest of the world that's trying to win the exact same market share as you are.
Do you think there's a potential advantage of addressing this issue not by the three individual countries, but as a region, with a regional perspective and a complementary perspective? And if so, what could be some mechanisms for the US, Mexico, and Canada to work better?
I think if you look at the supply chains of companies that are buying lots of semiconductors, they're already regional. Auto supply chains, already regional. Medical devices, already regional. Aviation, already regional. Electronics assembly, already regional. And so this is already a market that is responding to regional dynamics, supply chains that are structured across all three countries. And so it seems very natural that you'd devise a semiconductor strategy on a regional level rather than just on a country level.
We're going to have some chance in the end for some questions from the audience. So if you want to start sending them through the app or have the microphone ready, I still have a few questions for you, but just wanted to let the audience know that we will have that opportunity. In terms of sustainability, there's a strong push globally and in some industries and companies specifically to become net zero. Is this an issue for semiconductors companies? And if so, how does it play in their strategy?
Well, it's a tricky issue for semiconductor companies because they require tons of electricity, tons of power to operate a semiconductor manufacturing facility. However, many have also made very ambitious green energy targets. And so if you want to attract manufacturing, you've got to be able to meet the type of energy that they're requiring. And so I think that has been a sticking point in a number of geographies where companies have had net zero targets that they just couldn't meet. And so we've got to take that into consideration. I think also, if you look at water, another huge issue for semiconductor manufacturing, and again, a tricky one because the demands are huge and there are real environmental impacts. But I think the chip industry has now for the past 70 years gotten very, very good at using extraordinarily toxic chemicals in manufacturing processes and doing so with relatively little impact on the environment. So they got a really strong track record compared to most other industries. I think these are solvable problems.
There was some discussion earlier in terms of materials and rare earth. Is that something in which Latin America or North America could play a role as well?
It could, yeah. In semiconductors, there's rare earths. There's also gallium and germanium. Today, both of those minerals are almost completely monopolized in the refining in China. As of August 1st, China now has a licensing regime. We have to apply for an export license to the Chinese government in order to export gallium and germanium. Thus far, they've been liberally issuing export licenses. There hasn't been any disruption. But in all of these spheres, in lithium processing, in rare earths processing, in gallium processing, China's advantage is not geological. It's a combination of cheap capital, no environmental regulation, and the fact that they already monopolize the market so they can reduce prices whenever they want. And so what you find is whenever a rare earths mine anywhere else in the world gets up and running, they come online and then the Chinese government dictates to Chinese firms that prices fall by 50%. The rest of the world has to operate according to market outcomes. Capital markets don't want to fund industry like that. And so China retains its 98% market share. The reality is we're going to need government policy to address that monopolization. There's no global antitrust regulator that can break China's monopoly on processing rare earths and critical minerals. And so we're going to need to find other ways, and it's going to involve subsidizing mining, but more importantly, processing in other geographies.
AI, what's the relationship between semiconductors and AI? And I don't know if you have a broader comment about the future of AI, the AI and the implications for regional integration.
Well, I think there's an integral relationship between semiconductors and AI. If you look at the empirical evidence, the most advanced AI models have been doubling the amount of data used to train them every 6 months. So every 6 months, we have AI models trained on twice as much data. And people have said that data is the new oil. But I can assure you that if you talk to companies trying to train AI systems, they have lots of data, but they lack is processing power. Right now, there's such a severe shortage of GPUs, the type of specially designed semiconductors that train AI systems, that in Silicon Valley, there are now startups that have stopped investing dollars in AI firms because it's easy to raise dollars if you're an AI startup. They just give you GPUs because otherwise you can't get your hands on any. And GPUs are so constrained in supply because they're all designed by one company and produced in one factory in Taiwan. It's extraordinary concentration, and all of the world's leading AI companies, from OpenAI to Meta to Anthropic, they're all struggling to get their hands on the exact same type of semiconductor.
Do you worry about the concentration of AI in companies and for governments to struggle on how to regulate this? Or?
I think it's an interesting question to ask. It's an interesting area to watch. I guess I worry more that we're going to regulate before we understand, and in doing so, create roadblocks to dissemination. I think what you find with AI is that AI is not one technology. It's going to be 1,000 different things in 1,000 different industries. And what we need is rapid dissemination of AI in lots of different spheres. And I worry that regulation, if it's poorly done, is going to slow that dissemination process. And if you had to ask me who is best equipped to regulate AI, I wouldn't, for example, choose the 180-year-olds in the US Senate as my regulatory committee.
Fair point. We were earlier today with faculty and students at Tec de Monterrey, and one of them asking a difficult question that I want to ask you in front of. So, given the industry, technologies, changes, what would you recommend a young 17, 18-year-old North American to study in college?
Well, I think the answer is that we're not going to know what the skills that will be demanded are in 30 years' time. Impossible to know. And so in some ways what you want is the ability to keep learning, to learn how to learn and to reskill. And I think if you talk to companies, you hear constant focus on how can they get their employees to reskill and learn something new. But I do think looking at the extent to which AI is going to be applied to everything from agriculture to food delivery apps, that a more than passing familiarity with AI, how it's used, how systems are designed is going to be absolutely critical for young people entering the workforce.
Very good, thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions from the audience.
So first, with the US and Canada working together to build a semiconductor manufacturing corridor with IBM expanding in Bromont, Quebec, is there space for Mexican players to join in?
Well, I don't know if there's space for Mexican players to join in that specific corridor, but I would say that specific corridor is one tiny part of a much broader wave of investment into the semiconductor industry. And so I guess if I were advising Mexican business, Mexican policymakers, I would say don't over-index on that one project, because there are lots of projects of comparable scale or even bigger scale underway, and that's probably a better places to focus.
Next, do you think that the fact that Taiwan is so fundamental in the manufacturing of chips actually becomes an incentive for China to step in and invade or integrate the island to the mainland?
Now we have the easy questions. I think, so if there were a war in the Taiwan Straits, the chip-making facilities would shut down and they wouldn't reopen. Because to operate them, you need a regular supply of ultra-purified chemicals from Japan, the US and Europe. You need regular spare parts for the ultra-precise tools inside of the facilities in Taiwan. So if there's a war, it all shuts down, and we don't have any new smartphones for multiple years, or dishwashers, or cars, or medical devices. I worry, though, about a blockade, because if China were to blockade Taiwan, Taiwan's only hope would be for the US to try to break the blockade, and I'm not sure the US would. It might. President Biden has said now 4 times that he would intervene in such a scenario, and maybe that's true. He might only be president for 1 more year, we'll see. And so I think it's difficult to know how that type of scenario would play out. And if there was a blockade and the US signaled it wasn't going to come to Taiwan's aid, then I don't know how long you could expect Taiwan to hold out. And in that scenario, you could actually imagine China gaining control of Taiwan chip-making facilities.
Following up on that, are the concerns regarding workforce training legitimate? Do you believe that the US and North American region will be able to catch up with Asian competitors in regards to workforce capacity and training?
I spend a lot of time in Korea and Singapore and Taiwan and Japan, and I will tell you that they ask me regularly how can we make our workforce more like North America's? So I don't think we should overestimate the challenges that are faced. I think there certainly are certain niches where there's been underinvestment, and therefore there's been an insufficient quantity of workers going into these spheres in recent years, semiconductor manufacturing being most important among them. But I think the rest of the world looks on North America very enviously in terms of its workforce, and especially the technological capabilities of its workforce. Doesn't mean we don't have lots we should be doing, but I think we also shouldn't overstate challenges. And if you look at what has made East Asia so attractive for electronics manufacturing, it hasn't really been the skilled workforce as much as it's been the really deep ecosystem of suppliers. That's really what has made East Asia the most efficient place in the world to manufacture electronics. And if you want to replicate that, you've got to replicate the ecosystem. You've got to build it out.
Wonderful. Switching a little bit topics. In terms of minerals and energy, they're of the main topics to discuss in the semiconductor ecosystem. What are some of the challenges and perspectives in terms of nearshoring opportunities?
I think the biggest challenge in nearshoring is lining up the desire for more investment in the chip industry with customers that will commit to buying from North American sources. Right now, all demand for chips comes from companies that are very used to buying lots of chips from East Asia. Their supply chain divisions are structured around that because that's where they bought their chips for the past several decades. So the challenge is just to realign suppliers and demanders to help them realize that actually there's plenty of both in North America, and there could be even more of it if we invest in the right way. And that's the challenge. It's the coordination problem that we talked about. And the question is, can we get the coordination right so that we have the matching of supply and demand that will lead to more investment?
This is an interesting one. Is there a limitation for new semiconductor companies in Mexico because of the proprietary rights or patents?
You know, IP protections are really important in the chip industry for sure, but I've never heard anyone say that they're concerned about IP law in Mexico as a disincentive to investment. I don't think that's a serious challenge. And I think the chip industry is very comfortable with having IP from 20 different jurisdictions. And if you open up your smartphone, you will have IP from 20 different jurisdictions in the chips inside of your smartphone. So I don't think that's a primary challenge in terms of investment in Mexico.
Another interesting point on a potential challenge. What do you think the effect of AI is in valuations? Do you think that this could be a situation of a semiconductor or financial bubble?
I'm sure there are some aspects of the AI boom that are bubbly, no doubt. But I also know of a whole lot of Fortune 500 companies that are investing very heavily in trying to understand how can they deploy AI for their businesses. And that, to me, speaks to the real end demand for these types of capabilities. I think we're only in the very, very early innings of understanding how it is that the typical company will deploy AI. And it's going to be totally different for different companies. A retail company is going to use AI for totally different things than a manufacturing company. And that's great. That's how it should be.
With a question. What are venture capital funds in the US doing in terms of investing in startups or in companies in general?
So right now, the race is on to develop the best foundational model. That's what OpenAI is doing. That's what Anthropic's doing. That's what Facebook's doing. And that's a somewhat interesting race. But actually, I think the next question, which would be a far bigger question, is what are the ways in which these foundational models are deployed? Because it's not going to be the case that every company is going to have its own foundational model that they're going to spend tens and tens of billions of dollars building. Instead, it's going to be the case that they're going to take a foundation model from OpenAI or from Google or from Facebook and fine-tune it for their business. And right now, there's a lot of different potential business models for how you do that, different technology models for how you do that. But that's where I think venture capitalists are asking the most interesting questions. We already know who's in the race to build the big models. It's the companies that I just mentioned. So there's not much scope for new startups there, but there's a lot of scope for figuring out, well, what do you do with these incredible capabilities in terms of turning them into a product? And that's where no one really knows the answer.
Is the chip industry capital or labor intensive? Important question for Mexico.
Well, it depends where you're looking, actually, in the supply chain. So the manufacturing process is extraordinarily capital intensive. A new cutting edge chip fab costs $20 billion, are the most expensive factories in human history. But the rest of the supply chain is much less capital intensive. The design is not capital intensive at all. Your only cost is your workforce. And maybe you pay an office for them too, but that's about it. So there's not much capital required there. And then on assembly and packaging, it's much less capital intensive and more labor intensive. And that's why you've traditionally had that segment of the industry in places like Thailand or Taiwan or China with lower labor costs. And if you want to do assembly and test, you've got to do it in a way that is labor cost efficient.
In terms of geopolitics, how does your background, having studied Russia, impacted your understanding of what the current geopolitics are in terms of semiconductors?
Well, I guess everyone probably over-indexes on their own background in terms of interpreting the world around them. So that's a dangerous question. I think I would say two things. One is that the world learned last year, or remembered again last year, the fact that there can be extraordinary geopolitical shocks that seemed almost inconceivable until they happened. And then when they happened, had vast economic consequences that we were completely unprepared for. And the reality is that a Taiwan shock would be 100 times worse than a Russia-Ukraine shock in economic terms. And I'm not exaggerating, 100 times worse in dollar terms. So I think that's one lesson from that part of the world. The second lesson is that, if you ask yourself, why is it that Russia, a country full of brilliant physicists, has utterly failed in computing? The answer is that they never internationalized. And in fact, Russia's smartest computer scientists work for Facebook and Google. And that, I think, is testament to the centrality of international supply chains in the electronics industry and the computing industry, and that's not going to change. I do occasionally worry when I hear political leaders talk about self-sufficiency. That is a pipe dream. And instead what we need is not self-sufficiency, but just better supply chains, more resilient supply chains that are structured in ways that suit our interests. And that's why I think North America does have a real shot, if it doesn't miss the opportunity, to attract more semiconductor investment across the supply chain.
Wonderful. Thank you for answering our speed round of questions.
Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your ideas. Thank you for shaping the conversation, and hopefully you will be back in Mexico soon to continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
I hope so. Thank you.